your mindset. In my home country, Kenya, 15,000 people die every year because of diabetes. My name is Quresha Noor, and I want to change that. Living with diabetes is not easy. It is very complex. Without insulin, I cannot survive. I come from a marginalized Somali community where girl child education is not considered important. And I was discriminated because of my diabetes. Some people say that I cannot do anything. That includes getting education, going to school. I decided to prove them wrong and kill the stigma around diabetes. So I have started a community-based organization in Mombasa called the Diabetic Champions, where I empower young girls with diabetes to make them believe that they can become champions in their own life.
So welcome back from the break, and now we're going to move into the therapy area sessions. We'll start with diabetes, where we have the longest history, but we will talk to you about how we are going to continue to expand our leadership, both from a commercial execution point of view, but also from a pipeline point of view. And we will start, of course, with taking a look at our current leadership. You remember we set the targets last set. We've already met it. We are not going to stop here. We will continue to innovate in this space, and we also will talk to you about our commercial execution. The problem with diabetes is still huge. As you will recall, today 1 in 10 has diabetes, and in the future we expect that it will be 1 in 8. And it's not just living with diabetes that is the problem, it's actually also the comorbidities that are related to diabetes. You see here that it results in a life expectancy that is 8 years shorter. We also know that around 30% of people living with type 2 diabetes are also affected by cardiovascular disease. And if we take chronic kidney disease in its broadest sense, we know that 40% of people living with type 2 diabetes are affected by chronic kidney disease as well. So the unmet need is still huge, and there's a lot more we can do. To Marcus's point, innovation is not over in this space at all. Looking at our leadership, you see that we have expanded it to 33.8% of total diabetes. This is, of course, primarily driven by our GLP-1. The GLP-1 of total has actually doubled in the last few years, as you see here on the right-hand side. And this is, of course, primarily driven by the fact that GLP-1s can address not only sugar levels, but also cardiovascular risk, especially with Ozempic. You've seen the results. But of course also a very convenient treatment that is a once-weekly treatment. So we are going to continue to expand our leadership into these segments. We are looking to explore innovations that goes beyond just HbA1c, also more into the cardiometabolic space, as you heard earlier from Marcus. And we are also going to look at how we can do preventative, potentially in the future curative treatments. The prevention starts with obesity, knowing that obesity is the leading cause of type 2 diabetes. Of course, we're also going to work with digital solutions, how we can support patients, making it a lot easier to live with type 2 diabetes, but also type 1 diabetes when it comes to more intelligent devices and when it comes to also supporting dosing regimens. On the right-hand side, you see how we are competing with very significant brands, very well-known and recognized brands, both in the oral space, in the injectable GLP-1 space, and then we are, of course, looking forward to launching the world's first weekly insulin in not too long from now. We look forward to expanding also further, and Martin will talk to that in the future, into each of these segments with our innovations and further developments of the pipeline, as you see. But let's just dig into one of these innovations, icodec, for a moment. When we look at icodec, we know that there is a huge potential in the basal segment. It's the biggest of the insulin segments. We have a market share around 30%, and we know that there is a potential of around 40 billion Danish kroner in this segment. We expect, as you see here also, that icodec can make a real difference in the dynamic segment. The dynamic segment is basically people who are new to basal treatment or people who are willing to switch. And when we are asking physicians and patients whether a once-weekly insulin that has slightly better efficacy and comparable safety, whether that is interesting. We get very strong answers to that. That is certainly very interesting. More than 80% of physicians would say that just the once weekly approach to insulin is a reason to change insulin. So we expect that this dynamic segment will continue to expand from the 30% that it is today to an even more dynamic segment in the future because of the advantages of a once weekly insulin. We know also from patients that it's very cumbersome to be treated on a once daily regimen, and of course, while it's not exactly comparable to GLP-1s, we know that once weekly just have many advantages for patients. And here we have seen from our trials slightly better efficacy and similar safety, which is of course very relevant when it comes to insulin. The other focus we have is of course on GLP-1 and expanding into more, you can say, of the comorbidities related to type 2 diabetes. Here you see what we call a Venn diagram, and you will get all of this later, so you don't have to write down all the numbers in the bubbles. But what we will show you throughout the day, within the cardiometabolic space, we will show you the overlap of patient populations here from the US. We call it the Venn diagrams. It's based on statistics from the US National Health Surveys. And you will basically see the overlap between both diabetes, type 2 diabetes, of course, obesity, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, and so on. And in each of the sessions today, we will speak to some of this overlap because that's, of course, relevant for many of the trials that we have done with semaglutide. You see on the right-hand side where we have completed trials to show what are the benefits for people living with type 2 diabetes in terms of cardiovascular benefits. And Martin will show you later more about the flow data in the renal space and so on. So it's not only about glycemic control and weight management, but it's even about the broader, you can say, comorbidities reductions that we can see with semaglutide. So just an example, if we look at chronic kidney disease, not in the broader sense, but in a smaller sense, you see here chronic kidney disease stage 3, that is not exactly the same as what we had in the flow trial, but almost, so you can say similar. You will see an overlap of 5 million out of the 35 million patients living with type 2 diabetes. So there is a significant relevance here for having a molecule that can work on the comorbidities. And in the end, we also know that those are the costly aspects of type 2 diabetes. When we then look at how much is GLP-1 then utilized, you see here the trajectory over time of GLP-1. And you see that today it's only 6% of the scripts in diabetes that is, or the usage of GLP-1 across the globe. If we look at the US, it's 16% of the scripts. If we look at some of the other regions, it is less because we have rolled out later and so has competition. But it is fair to say that whenever there's been a new launch into this segment, we've seen an increased usage. But of course, also with the data that I just mentioned before, and then Martin will be talking to later, we know that this is, of course, of relevance for using GLP-1 treatment, and especially with the data we have on Ozempic and Rybelsus. When you look at guidelines, they have also changed. They have now included GLP-1s as first-line usage. And this, of course, means also that there is increased support for physicians to use these products. So overall, it means that with 6% of the scripts today, the potential remains very big in this space. And this is, of course, what we are also embarking on when we are expanding our, you can say, life cycle management of Ozempic with more and more indications, as you have seen the data and will be seeing in the future. So with that potential in mind, I would just like to now hand over to Doug Langer to hear how we are executing on that in North America. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Camilla. It's great to be back at Capital Markets Day. I was reflecting this week that this is my 4th one in this role, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So when we think about diabetes care in North America, you can see that we've had strong performance over the last several years, and we're very proud of that, putting more and more patients on our products. What we saw in the last 2 years was really a step change in performance, and that came on the backs, as you also see on GLP-1, namely Ozempic and Rybelsus. And I'm going to get into that in a second. What we also see, and Camilla alluded to, was a category that is still underutilized. Now, in the US, the category grew by 50% last year. And as we indicated, what we saw in the fourth quarter was probably more indicative of what we'll see this year, was in that 30% range. But it still is a growing category that is still underutilized, and we still feel like we have the best brands to produce in that category. So back to my capital markets reference. So my first Capital Markets Day was in 2017, and we did it that year in November for those of you that participated. And during that capital markets, I had Dave Moore with me, and Dave we had recently hired as sort of the chief marketing officer. And part of the hook I had to get Dave to come was this product called semaglutide, and we were hopeful for an approval. And a month later, we got it, and 2 months later, we launched. So if we look back from 17 to 2023, how did we do? And I took some notes this morning in my hotel room, and I was so excited I didn't want to forget any. So I'll share some of these data points with you and see if you're as excited as me. So last year, we had over 4.5 million patients on Ozempic. 2023, we were a 9 times blockbuster, adding, that was 63 billion DKK, adding 24 billion to that, to sales, which equated to a 67% growth year over year. Even with intense competition, we are still the MBRX and TRX leader. And I can say this with confidence. I asked my marketing team again on the latest ATUs. We are the best known, most preferred diabetes drug in the category today. So we're really proud about that. But what we're also proud about is that what we still see is 80% of the category is still coming outside of GLP-1. Or if you look again, it's 50% is either naive or generic. So we're seeing it used earlier in their treatment, and we're seeing at least and consistently 80% of that coming outside of GLP-1. What we also see is a stay time of roughly 4 years. And also importantly, we're seeing almost 60% of the patients that start on the product are staying on the product. So we feel really good. We feel really good about the products that we have in a growing category, and we're extremely confident. Now, I would be remiss in not doing my job if I also didn't talk about the opportunity that we've had, that we will have with insulin icodec. And we do hope to get a regulatory decision this year. And why we're excited is I don't have to tell this room that in the US, we've had challenges with insulin over the last many years. I think we've managed them well. But in my mind, there is no better company and there is no better place to launch this innovation into a market that desperately needs it. So we have the plans in place, and we're excited about what this product can mean for patients and providers. And we also think there is an opportunity. If you look at the US market, it's about 10 billion DKK in terms of opportunity, and half of that is still with insulin glargine. So there still is an opportunity, and we are really excited about this opportunity and what we can do and what it can deliver for patients. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to my good friend and colleague, Mike Dustar.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to see Doug excited.
I am excited.
I can say that equally, we are also really excited in international operations. The diabetes business in IO has had a really good double-digit growth for the last 5-6 years and continues to do so. It really is on a basis of a solid insulin business that we have been building for many, many, many years, and is quite stable, albeit growing much lower than the GLP-1. And then, of course, the more recent years, with the launch of Ozempic in 2019, seeing what Doug just alluded to, a massive growth across various different geographies in IO with the GLP-1 products. If you take that growth area, the GLP-1, and turn them into customers, patients, then you see the slide on the part of the slide on your right-hand side. There are around 6 million people in international operations that use GLP-1 products, ours and our competitors. And that number is around double as much as it was just 2 years, 3 years ago. So this is really fast growing. Yes, 6 million maybe right now is still a small number when you think about the totality of people that need diabetes products, but it's really growing fast. And you can also see that the money that is generated, the financials that is generated from those 6 million people, 71% of it comes to Novo Nordisk. That's our market share, and it's growing. You see two line that's growing, that's Ozempic and Rybelsus. Two line that's declining, that's Victoza and one of our competitors. And then another line that's hardly to see at this point. Just facts. Then I want to touch upon Rybelsus because I'm actually quite happy about Rybelsus. In the first year that we launched this product, it's a blockbuster for us in IO. And that we don't see. We actually don't because prices are different, dynamics are different. There are very seldom where you see first year, first launch of any product in international operations, ex-US, where you see a blockbuster status. We saw that with Rybelsus. I'm also super excited, of course, about that one. Now, when then you think about the dynamic of GLP-1, and I will have one slide on GLP-1 and one on insulin next. The dynamic of the GLP-1 really goes back to, so how many patients are there in international operations and that possibly can use some of these products? And Pete, I think you asked a question to Henrik where he showed you two data points. One, he actually had the number of the products that we had, 40 million, 35 of them are in IO. The other one he did not show you. I have numbers on my slides. They say the sky is the limit. And honestly, if you take the time into the future, and I don't know how long into the future, that other data point for me internally is that there are 480 million plus individuals that can possibly at one point or the other become part of our customers at one point or the other. And that, of course, super excites us. Actually, when you think about IO, externally IO is referred to as international operations. Internally, we think about this as immense opportunity. When then, of course, you dig deeper into the numbers in the middle, then you also see, and I think Camilla also a little bit alluded to it, that right now, all the people who are not taking insulin, they're taking actually some of the more modern medications, happens to be GLP-1 and or SGLT2 and DPP-4s in a tablet format, then 4% of the totality, so you see that in the middle, 4% of the totality of the market, diabetes market right now is taking a GLP-1 product. It is a small number, but it's growing so rapidly. And it's growing on the back of, again, number of fantastic products that we have a really strong footprint. And maybe the single difference in IO between us and our competitor is our footprint on how and where we are with our organization. Ozempic is available today in 78 markets. That's a lot of markets. Rybelsus in 47 markets. And that's actually a competitive advantage that we have. And no wonder why also we have a relatively high share of growth when it comes to both value or volume of these businesses. And again, coming back to Rybelsus here, it says 29% of the value share of growth, 20% of the total diabetes value that is generated in international operations comes from Rybelsus. That's quite impressive. And then, of course, insulin, we don't forget that in IO, because as I mentioned, 30 million of the 35 million we serve in IO are still on insulin. And they're very dear to us, so it's absolutely important that we innovate for them and we continue treating them regardless of where they are across the world. We have still a solid business with our modern and human insulin business. Many people cannot afford some of the products that are coming to the market right now, but we have actually fantastic drugs for them in human and modern insulin, and we'll continue to serve them. Next generation insulin also gives us many patients around the world. We continue serving them. But of course, before I leave, I have to say I'm super excited that we're getting very, very close to the launches of our two next insulin products, icodec and icosema. They're going to be fantastic, predominantly also because the segment they serve, the basal segment, is the largest where we don't have yet leadership. So market share gain in that segment with the weekly best-in-class product excites me immensely. And then hopefully soon after that, many more things. And who better to say that than Martin?
Thank you very much, Mike. So you've already heard it a couple of times. We work in areas and in disease areas where there's a huge unmet need. We still see that in type 1 diabetes. We still see that in type 2 diabetes. And that basically means that we will continue to innovate in those disease areas. We have a strong pipeline. Looking at what we're doing currently in both the subcutaneous but also the oral incretin space, we have a leading pipeline. Obviously building on semaglutide, where we're now not only focusing on glycemic control, on weight loss, and weight loss is also incredibly important in type 2 diabetes, but we are also focusing on comorbidities. We know for a couple of years that Ozempic is associated with a 26% decrease in risk of cardiovascular disease. We've just released the flow data, and we'll continue to look at other aspects of comorbidities related to diabetes. But we'll also do innovation. And it's very, very clear that combining the base of GLP-1, specifically semaglutide, where we've seen these amazing outcomes, with novel biologies, is leading to next generation of innovation. You've seen the amycretin data from Marcus this morning. I don't think it's a secret that we in this company like the amylin biology. Amylin is boding incredibly well in the obesity space. We'll come back to that, but actually also in the diabetes space. And having two assets, one in phase 3 and one in phase 1, already at this point, is a really, really strong proposition. In particular, when we combine that with Henrik and his ability to scale, we believe that we can have a truly differentiated and very, very competitive pipeline in this space. We also have to say there's still room for innovation in the insulin space. You've heard Camilla, Doug, and Mike talk about icodec. We have very high aspirations for icodec. It is an incredible innovation in terms of efficacy combined with good safety, and at the same time, it's more convenient than ever for the patients. I can say the same thing for icosema, and therefore we are very, very proud of the continuous innovation that we'll bring to our patients. And Marcus and his team are working hard on also getting our glucose-sensitive insulin back into human testing. But we also have a keen eye on type 1 diabetes. We've heard it also from Marcus. One of our focus areas is to change the trajectory of disease, either preventing or maybe even curing disease. We have that outlook in type 1 diabetes, both actually the prevention part, but also the potential for curing part through cell-based therapies. Obviously incredibly exciting. I'll do a few deep dives now, starting actually with what we're doing with semaglutide, the flow trial. If you remember from Camilla's Venn diagram, there's a big overlap between type 2 diabetes and kidney disease. A big number of patients suffer from chronic kidney disease if they have type 2 diabetes. This leads to detrimental outcomes, both kidney-related, but actually also cardiovascular-related outcomes. And we have to remember both in chronic kidney disease, but actually also in liver disease, the biggest reason for premature mortality in this space is actually cardiovascular mortality. So the flow trial was designed in an outcomes manner where we looked at semaglutide 1.0 milligram versus placebo. And the primary endpoint was a 5 composite endpoint looking at time to first event in either kidney-related or cardiovascular-related endpoints. We're really, really happy about the data. So the primary endpoint that evaluated 5 components, 3 related to progression of chronic kidney disease, 2 to the either risk of kidney mortality or cardiovascular mortality. And combining those 5 endpoints, we saw a 24% decrease in risk. I think it's important to call out that this is on top of standard of care. At the end of trial, more than 30% of patients were actually on an SGLT2, and still we see an amazing 24% decrease in risk. I think it's also important to call out that both the CKD and cardiovascular components contributed to the primary endpoint. And I may want to call out, I can't give you the number because we still have to publish it, but I do want to call out that if we, for example, look at cardiovascular disease, we see a significant decrease in this population, specifically for cardiovascular disease. That's actually quite amazing. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And we take a lot of pride in what semaglutide can do in this space. But it doesn't really stop there, because if we allow ourselves to just spend a little bit of time on the secondary endpoints, the confirmatory secondary endpoints, these are actually quite amazing. So obviously, we have a very nice hit, 24% risk decrease on the primary endpoint. That's a composite endpoint. But we also look at the change in GFR, that's glomerular filtration rate, and that's a measure of kidney function. And what we can see is that semaglutide changes the slope, delaying the progression towards end-stage renal disease. Importantly, and that's the third confirmatory endpoint, semaglutide significantly reduces the risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular events. That's stroke, that's myocardial infarction, and that's cardiovascular death. And finally, we also see that semaglutide decreases the risk for all-cause mortality. All of this is statistically significant, and obviously in this trial, clinically exceedingly relevant. And I just want to remind you, it's the second time in a matter of a couple of months where we show that semaglutide decreases all-cause mortality in diabetes, but also in obesity. So really, really strong offering, and very excited about the data. We continue that journey. A lot of patients who suffer from both diabetes, but actually also obesity, suffer also from what we call osteoarthritis. That's not what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to talk about atherosclerosis. So I apologize for that. A big unmet need also in this space is obviously the part of cardiovascular disease that is peripheral arterial disease. More than 200 million patients suffer from this globally. It is closely associated with atherosclerosis. We've seen in our previous trials that semaglutide can actually reduce, and these are retrospective analyses, can reduce the risk of having peripheral artery disease. It's big, and there's a huge unmet need because there's no treatment available. 25% of all cardiovascular disease has the nature of peripheral artery disease. This is debilitating for the patient. They can have less functionality, and therefore, if we can change that outlook, obviously we need to do that. STRIDE will read out during the first half of this year. We're looking very much forward to that. It's again a simple trial. Patients randomized to either semaglutide 1.0 milligram or placebo for 52 weeks, looking both at the primary but also secondary endpoints of functionality, improving functionality in these patients. But actually also looking at the harder endpoints of what we can do in this space. I want to go back to my secret love, and that is amylin. Maybe it's not so secret anymore. You've seen these data before. This is what makes us excited. In a reasonably small type 2 phase 2 program in type 2 diabetes, we see that amylin combined with semaglutide improves glycemic control significantly and clinically relevant, 0.4 percentage points after 32 weeks. We also know from amylin biology that that improves over time. So we do actually have a potential for aspiring for even better glycemic control when we do a more than a year-long study. But what is even more exciting is the weight loss that we see in type 2 diabetes. Currently out there, you see weight losses around 13%, at the max in type 2 diabetes. Based on these data, we can safely say that CagriSema holds the potential of delivering maybe more than 20% of weight loss in type 2 diabetes. Clearly differentiated, and this is why we love it. We also see more than additivity, we actually see synergy on cardiovascular markers of risk. So we are taking semaglutide into phase 2 in diabetes. We still haven't seen, amycretin. CagriSema is currently in phase 3. So this is obviously something that we are very excited about. We will see readouts of that next year. But going back to Marcus's point, we are also excited about what can amycretin do, not only in obesity, but also potentially in diabetes. We haven't seen diabetes data for amycretin yet. And that basically means that we are now conducting a phase 2 trial. And you are asking me how long that will take. I will just point you back to the CagriSema days where we also did a phase 2 trial for type 2 diabetes. And we did that, I think, faster than I've ever seen a phase 2 trial being conducted before, and we intend to do the same thing for amycretin. It doesn't really stop here. We also actually have some really, really nice data for our GLP-1 GIP. You saw from Marcus that we're working both on a once weekly, but potentially also on a once monthly. That holds big potential also. We see some very strong data on glycemic control, some very strong data on weight loss. Maybe not fully to the tune of what we see with CagriSema and amycretin, but still very exciting. We're very excited about what we see in our pipeline, both in the clinical space, but certainly also what is coming in from Marcus in terms of novel biology. And we believe that is required because the number of patients who suffer from both type 1 and type 2 diabetes is increasing. There's still room for innovation because there's still a huge unmet need. We believe that part of that need can be addressed by incretins, maybe combined also with the amylin biology. And given that around 6% of patients globally today are on a GLP-1 analog with type 2 diabetes, there's a big growth potential. But there's also a big potential for innovation. And obviously, we are very proud and happy with what we do with icodec, IcoSema, CagriSema, and amycretin. So with that, I think we will invite both the presenters, but also Lars to modify a Q&A.
Thank you, Martin. And let's get colleagues up. And obviously, it was easier in the old days when there was only one molecule in development. So now we have to keep track of all of them.
So even I get confused.
So maybe we start from this side this time.
Thank you. Peter Welford, Jefferies. Wanted to ask you a question on what excites you the most, amylin. Curious in particular, you talked, right, actually it was the presentation before, you talked about a new amylin in the pipeline. Curious, what is it you see that potentially could be bettered on cagrilintide? And what is the rationale therefore for pursuing in your mind a better or newer amylin?
So we know already from the GLP-1 space that you can always improve your approach to the biology. We've seen that going from Victoza to semaglutide, and obviously we want to pursue the best possible amylin monotherapy. At this point in time, it's exploratory. We're really, really happy with what we've seen, obviously, with cagrilintide, but we are specifically also very happy with what we've seen with the monocomponent, the unimolecular format of amycretin. So currently, we are adding to our pipeline, but it also allows us to choose, because as both Marcus and I have spoken to, we'll not bring not differentiated products to the market. We don't think that's who we are, and that's not helping patients. So obviously allowing ourselves the flexibility of choosing is an important part of what we do when we double down in both diabetes and in obesity.
Thank you. Here.
Thank you. It's Harry Sefton from UBS. On the flow data, can you talk about the SGLT2 use? Can you specifically show an additive effect over SGLT2 with SEMA in this study? Is that a subgroup that you're going to look at specifically?
So these are early days. At the baseline of the trial, we saw 15% of patients being on SGLT2. More were added in during the course of the trial. At the end of trial, approximately 30% were on an SGLT2, and actually more on placebo than in the semaglutide arm. And this is probably to be expected. What we also see is actually that the number of events, because it is the smaller population, is lower when we combine GLP-1 and SGLT2. And therefore, we should be a little bit cautious to interpret the data. I think it's very, very clear, specifically on the cardiovascular endpoints, that we see that the benefit of combination, or rather the benefit of semaglutide, is there on top of SGLT2.
Martin?
Thank you, Martin Parker from SEB. Just to Martin, maybe you could elaborate a little bit, because we saw you highlighted that we'll see a superiority on all-cause death, but comparing to Sustain 6, which of course also were in diabetic patients, that was actually 1.05, as I recall it, on the hazard ratio. So what's the difference between these two trials that you can end up with two different results?
So you've heard me say this a good number of times. I'm really concerned always comparing across trials. I've also heard some comparisons to SGLT2 trials and their outcomes. There are differences in population. So duration of diabetes, how many patients have, and in Sustain 6, not all patients had chronic kidney disease. Only around 40% of patients had chronic kidney disease. Here, obviously, all patients had chronic kidney disease. There's a difference in the level of cardiovascular disease. In FLOW, these patients were very, very sick, with established both heart failure, previous MI, previous stroke, established peripheral artery disease. There's difference in the background medication, and we actually see that the FLOW trial has a very high level of RAS blockers, very high level of hypertension, very high level of dyslipidemia, all of those to the tune of 90% plus. And that basically means that you can't really compare neither to Sustain 6, where the actual endpoint also was different. So the composite endpoint that we have in FLOW is different. What the endpoint described as Sustain 6 is, can't really compare across. If you really want to know, you have to do the head-to-head.
Thank you, Martin. Richard?
Thanks. Richard Vosser from JP Morgan. Maybe just going back to the GLP-1 GIP. I mean, you've talked about amylin very passionately, but you're doing a monthly version of GIP, GLP-1. You know, what's different, I suppose, in the biology that doesn't allow you to do a monthly, or should we expect that for amylin? And sort of, you know, why pursue GIP? You've talked about cardiovascular, maybe not as good. So just why even pursue it?
So GLP-1 GIP is not bad. We believe that from a weight loss, from a glycemic control, but potentially also from a cardiovascular perspective, amylin plus GLP-1 is better. But we do see, and you saw that in the slide, we do see good weight loss, and we do see good glycemic control with GLP-1 GIP. When Marcus then has the opportunity to investigate a less frequent dosing, in this case once monthly, in that biology, then obviously we take that opportunity, because it's not a bad biology. We just believe that GLP-1 amylin has a bigger potential.
Michael, and then we move backwards.
Thank you, Michael Novot from Nordea. So Martin, can you say in 5 years from now, where do we stand in terms of generational-wise on the SNAC technology and the ability to significantly increase bioavailability? And in that respect also, is there a way forward with this technology to reduce the food and water restrictions?
So specifically on water restrictions or fluid restrictions, we don't see a big impact on that, neither in our clinical trials nor in the market. I think Mike spoke to the success of Rybelsus. So that's really not a big concern for us. Obviously, we're looking into this, but it's not our biggest focus area. On the generation and the bioavailability, we see continuous progress. You've already seen us moving into the next generations. I think Marcus is currently working on generation 7. Not all of those will be taken into the clinical space because obviously, again, it has to be not a minimal, but rather larger stepwise improvements in what we see in terms of bioavailability. But we see that continuously, thereby also supporting Henrik in his endeavors.
Simon?
Thank you. Simon Baker from Redburn Atlantic. I'll give Martin a breather on this one. This question's essentially for everybody else. Tying back to what you said in the presentation this morning, Lars, that we've seen a lot of data today and previously showing tremendous growth of GLP-1, whether it's in diabetes or obesity, but still very low penetration in the grand scheme of things. So I was wondering, as you've demonstrated more on the benefit of GLP-1 across both indications, how has the cost-benefit discussion with payers evolved? Because I'm assuming it's getting incrementally a little bit easier as they see the benefit. We're still at a very low point. How has it, across different regions, changed? Do people get it more than they used to a few years ago? And how should we then think about where we're headed in light of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So maybe Doug and Mike, a perspective on how you see, say, the payer reaction, and maybe while you think about that, Camilla, you can allude a bit to the overall health economics perspective we see for this type of medicine.
Yeah, so as a starting point, we're still at over 95% access for both Rybelsus and Ozempic, so that's extremely positive. And I would say part of our job is always to demonstrate the value of our brands. And yes, to your point, as we see increase in indications and the potential penetration and benefit into other comorbidities, I don't know if the conversation is getting easier because the flip side of that is that the size and scale is getting larger. But certainly those are more robust conversations as we're having them with vertically integrated health systems. So yeah, I think it's a benefit for us, the amount of data.
I think on the penetration question, you have to separate the generation 1 and generation 2 of GLP-1. If you think about the generation 2, Camilla showed a picture that penetration is around 15% in US where we went first, and lower because simply this has been just a few years, not mentioning COVID was in the middle of the whole thing as well. Having said this, within diabetes across the world, GLP-1 to a large extent is reimbursed right now. So people have understood the benefits of products like Ozempic and Rybelsus. It's our job now to bridge that into the obesity, of course, and make sure that that continues.
Yeah. And on that point, in the health economic models, in the beginning, or a few years back, we saw mainly a focus on HbA1c, and then a modeling in terms of what would that mean in terms of risk of other serious complications. But now we actually have the exact data, so we don't need to rely on DCCT, or if some of you remember that, and UK PDS more than 20 years ago, even 30 years ago soon. So we actually have that data now, and that goes into these models and the discussions. To Doc's point, cost effectiveness remains very important, but of course budgetary impact short term is equally also an issue. But of course here some of the data that we also generate, we can also show impact on hospitalization and other things that are sometimes quite immediate even.
Good. That perfectly closes the Q&A session on diabetes. So we now have a slightly shorter break, so 10 minutes. So please be back after a short break. Thank you very much.